Today, we're going to be speaking with Clancy Martin, who's a writer and philosophy professor whose latest book is a memoir about his multiple suicide attempts, How Not to Kill Yourself, a portrait of the suicidal mind. Clancy, it's so great to have you on. And I mean, this book, it's such a well, you tell me, it seems like such a personal and sensitive experience. What was the thought process behind deciding to write about this?
How it happened was some years ago, a magazine had contacted me and they wanted a long form memoir. And I wasn't sure what to write about. So I said, how about a kind of contemporary One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest? And as I was writing it, working with that editor, um, someone dear to him attempted suicide. And he said to me, I notice every time you've been in the psychiatric hospital, it's because you've tried to take your own life. And I said, yeah, that's true. And he said, so I wonder if you could focus on that. And so I wrote that piece and it went up on Huffington Post and it kind of went viral. And then I had people emailing me from all over the world saying, I was Googling how to kill myself and I read your piece and I changed my mind. And then I was like, okay, that piece is just a little snapshot of my actual experience with suicide. So I thought I had this opportunity and also honestly kind of this obligation to tell the whole story.
You talk in the book about how suicide attempts are often the sort of culmination of long-standing issues or a sort of building life circumstance of sorts. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the myths of suicide is that a suicide is like a very impulsive thing, and then someone maybe makes an attempt, hopefully survives, and then goes on with their life. And that's really not the way it works. Most people who make suicide attempts are suffering from chronic suicidal ideation. They're thinking about suicide a lot. The World Health Organization estimates that 10% of the world population suffers from some form of chronic suicidal ideation. So we're talking about, somewhere around 700 million people around the world. And then what happens is, someone's thinking about suicide a lot. They have this habit of thinking about suicide. It's part of their structure of their belief. And then events start building up and your vision of your options gets narrower and narrower and narrower. And then you think this is the only decision that you can make. And so in my own life, for example, when I was in the luxury jewelry business for a long time, it's just like every day being in business was unhappier than the day before. And I got to this point where, every morning, part of my morning ritual was going into the bathroom and taking the gun that I had at that time and putting it in my mouth every morning after morning. And this happens, kind of thing is happening with all kinds of people from every walk of life. And so we need to be having conversations like this so that people who are struggling with this kind of ideation realize they're not alone. That alone is a huge step forward.
There's sometimes in media reports after the suicide of a known or well-known person, or even not sometimes, just even when it's not a well-known person, there's these stories that come forward like, you never would have guessed. I had no idea. This came out of nowhere. If we put aside for a second what you're saying about frequently the thought goes on for a long time, focusing in on the idea of concealing the ideation, or even, as you've talked about, the attempts from people in your life. Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, all of us, of course, have all these masks that we wear. You have your mask as a parent, your mask as a friend, your mask, and you're trying to integrate these things to be the sort of maximally authentic you. But it's just the nature of human society that we have all these different roles. And one of the roles that a lot of people particularly in, I think in here in America, we feel the need to play is kind of the role of the happy, successful person who's managing, dealing with life and everything. And one of the problems with that, particularly if you're struggling with depression and anxiety, is it makes it very difficult for you to be honest with other people about how you're feeling. And the one thing that we know that is a guaranteed medicine for thinking about suicide and for avoiding a suicide attempt is talking to another human being about it. And so we have to, if we're worried about someone, we have to remember, just always reach out, always say, hey, what's going on with you? Let's like just talk as normal people. Look, what you seem like you seem really stressed out or whatever it happens to be. And if you're struggling yourself, I beg of you, try to reach out to someone. I know there one time, not so long ago, I was going through a really rough period and I felt like I couldn't talk to anyone around me. And I texted my roofer, the guy who was working on my roof, just because he seemed like a good guy, and said, man, I'm having a really lousy day. How's your day going? And this guy, without knowing what he was doing, he talked me off the ledge, literally.
Wow. I've spoken to many people, and I've had thoughts myself that relate more to the fragility of life than to suicidal ideation. I'll give you some examples. So you're driving on a non-divided highway, right? Where there's oncoming traffic in the next lane over. And you have a realization that I could just turn the wheel. It's an inch of hand motion, and could end up losing my life or taking someone's life that's driving in the opposite direction. Or waiting in the New York City subway and realizing I could just step in front of this train right now. And I think that there are many in the mental health field who say these are intrusive thoughts. They don't necessarily relate to actual suicidal ideation, but it's good to recognize when these are going on. Can you talk about, is there a clear dividing line between those types of thoughts and whatever we might think of as this next level of ideation that you experienced?
I think I think it's really important to recognize what you've pointed out, that these thoughts that we think of as intrusive thoughts occur on a spectrum. So the spectrum starts with something like intrusive thoughts, and then those thoughts might get more and more intrusive, might seem more and more appealing, and then the stage we get most worried about is when people start actually planning based on those thoughts. And it is indeed a spectrum. But the reason what you said is so wise and why it's such an excellent question is that for people who are wrestling with this, they should know that everybody, as you say, has these kinds of thoughts pop into their head. Or there are very few people who don't. I have spoken to people who say they've never even had that kind of thought pop into their head, but I think they're few and far between. And the key to this, once you recognize that those thoughts are just thoughts, is being able, rather than rebelling against those thoughts or fearing those thoughts or letting those thoughts control you, just being able to recognize that they're thoughts, like any other thought, and you have all these crazy thoughts as a human being that you don't act on, and you don't have to act on this one either. And if you can, even if you have chronic suicidal ideation and you think about it all the time, you can start to change your relationship with that thinking by, rather than trying to push the thought away or by moving in the direction of the thought, just recognizing it as a thought, maybe even embracing it and caring for it as a thought, saying, yeah, I'm gonna take care of this little scary thought, and then letting it go.
That's very interesting. So in the same way, I don't know if you're saying this, but in the same way that someone who lives in the US might say, I could go to the Philippines and just like start over. I could just abandon everything I know and just like move to the Philippines. Okay, now I'm going to go on with my day and I'm going to go pick up my kid and get groceries, and you don't act on it. In the same way, I could very easily just step in front of the subway. It doesn't have to necessarily be considered a special category of thought.
Exactly right. Yeah, 100% exactly right.
Philosophy has many different things to say about suicide. And depending on, what you read and from what era, from what source, etc., you can find a lot of different opinions or philosophizing about that idea. In preparing for this interview, I came across some pieces that maybe suggest or believe that a philosopher might in some way be, I don't know if better insulated from more serious suicidal ideation, but that philosophy in some way might have a protective element to it. Can you weigh in on that at all?
I think it's true. I wondered about that before I was writing this book. And then I spent, a couple of years, just literally a couple of years, reading everything that every philosopher in the Western and Eastern traditions has ever had to say about suicide. And slowly but surely, my own attitudes towards my own suicidal ideation, I could feel them shifting. And the reason they were shifting, I think, is that these arguments, like, for example, the argument that your life is not entirely your own, but
Mm.
belongs to a lot of other people around you. In the book, I say taking your own life is sort of like burning down your house without recognizing that there are a whole bunch of other people living in the house with you. And this is a classic argument from the philosophers. Or Seneca's classic argument that he's a Stoic and comes from the Stoics, that the door is always open, you're always free to do this. So you don't have to do it today. You can just wait a day. You do it tomorrow. And I always use this argument when people come to me in crisis, every time. Just wait a day. The door is always open. They actually really do work. It's a little surprising to me because as professional philosophers, this is my business. We often start to kind of worry, does philosophy bake any bread? Does it actually do anything in the world? But you know what? It does. It can save lives.
When you talked about the incorrect notion of the impulsivity of the attempt, that often it's the end result of a cumulative whatever, many different things that go on. There are stories of someone who pulls a trigger or jumps or whatever, where instantly they know they regret it. Talk a little bit about that contrast between the long cumulative lead up and the instant regret.
Yeah, I think that one of the interesting things, there's this famous story about this guy who jumped off the Golden Gate Bridge. And as soon as he jumped, he thought to himself, I realized in that moment that everything in my life was totally fixable, except for the fact of my having jumped off this bridge, and happily he survived and went on to talk about it. And there are lots of these stories. And I have experienced that myself. I think it's also important to remember that a person who's made an attempt is not necessarily going to feel that way, especially right after, let's say, she wakes up in the hospital from her attempt. So another friend of mine, famous scholar of ancient languages, when he made his attempt, he woke up in the hospital and he was as he put it, absolutely gutted. He was just miserable that he had survived. And I've had that experience as well. I think that when you're thinking about making an attempt, you're very often thinking that, like, okay, there's this only, your thinking is the blinders have become so narrow and the weight and the pain have become so oppressive that you start to think there's only one way out. The only way out is to take my own life. And then when you make the attempt, suddenly something in your mind, hopefully, if you're lucky, you realize, wait, no, that just wasn't true. That thinking was confused. And hopefully, again, if you survive the attempt, you will come around to seeing, as many people do, that no, that was a confused way of thinking that was just brought on by severe pain and a kind of paradoxical thinking that the fact that you're willing to kill yourself is proof that you actually ought to be, you actually ought to do it because you're such a bad person who would conceive of this in the first place. You feel that way, and that's totally confused. So there are a few things that people are feeling this way and need to try to remember that, like, just do anything to lighten the pressure a little bit, do anything to open the blinders a little bit, do anything to ease the pain a little bit. And that these can be very simple things. Taking a walk almost always will help. Talking to a friend almost always will help. If, a friend of mine who's had multiple attempts, who's a wonderful on with helping survivors, Desiree Lestage. Her thing was she'd go get a frappuccino. When she could tell she was getting close to the edge, she'd go get herself a frappuccino, and that's what helped her. For me, at a certain stage of my life, going to get a 99-cent ice cream cone from McDonald's could literally save my life. So people who are at risk in particular should recognize those things. Also, very crucially and quickly, they should not have a gun in the house, or if they do keep a gun in the house and they're committed to it, when they can see they're getting into a troubled headspace, they should give the gun to a friend, or somehow or other get that gun away from themselves. Because
that was actually the next thing I planned to ask about, which is there are different, it's weird to call it a success rate, but there are different success rates for suicide attempts based on what tools or methods one attempts to employ. And very high at the top of the list is, of course, guns. Can you talk a little bit? I mean, you've already said if you have a gun or have access to one, you should recognize when you're at a certain place and remove access to yourself from that firearm. May be difficult for some people to do. Can you talk a little bit about the role of firearms here?
Yeah, I mean, there's a direct correlation between people's access to firearms and death by suicide. And particularly in those states with high rates of gun ownership, consistently, we have higher rates of death by suicide. It's just one of the very clear statistics on suicide. So what we know is, and they've been, people are working on this. What we know is it will help even a little bit if you have a gun safe in the house. Just that much, making it a little bit harder to get to your gun is better. Now, I tell everyone, the many, many people who come to me to talk about when they're on the brink of making an attempt, I tell them, you really need to just do me a favor and go give that gun to a friend for a little while. Doesn't matter who it is, and actually physically get it out of the house. But as you say, for some people, depending upon their profession, that may be impossible, or it may also be that their beliefs about gun ownership are just so strong that they really are not willing to do that.
Yeah.
So then at a minimum, get a gun safe, lock that sucker up. And you could also, since you can recognize that people depend on you and love you, and you can feel like, okay, I'm getting into this risky situation, you could ask someone to change the combination on the gun safe for you for a while. And they're trying this out in states right now, and it's working. It's lowering the rates of death by gun in those states. What a lot of people don't realize is the vast majority of death by gun in this country is not someone killing someone else. It's someone killing themselves.
Excellent advice, and practical and easy to apply. The book is How Not to Kill Yourself, A Portrait of the Suicidal Mind. And we've been speaking with the book's author, Clancy Martin, who's a writer and philosophy professor. Really appreciate your time, your insights, and sharing your story.
David, I can't thank you enough for your show and for addressing this topic, which the one thing we know for certain is that when people address this topic in the media in an informed, thoughtful way like this, suicide rates go down. So you're actually saving lives just by doing this show.